The stagecoach bucked one last time, a final groan of strained wood and leather, before settling into a cloud of its own making. Through the thin glass, Eleanor Hart saw Dry Creek for the first time. It was less a town than a wound on the landscape, a collection of sun-bleached buildings huddled together as if for comfort against the vast, unforgiving expanse of New Mexico territory. The year was 1883, and the dust, fine as ash, coated everything, turning the world a uniform shade of weary brown. It settled on the brim of her bonnet, on the worn cover of the Bible in her lap, and in the back of her throat, a taste of grit and failed rain. She had spent all her 19 years behind the cool stone walls of the St. Agnes Convent, a world ordered by the ringing of bells, the scent of beeswax, and the gentle murmur of prayer. That world was green and soft, watered by the grace of God and the patient hands of the sisters. Dry Creek was its antithesis. The only law here, she had been warned, was the weight of a man's purse and the speed of his gun. For a moment, a tremor of doubt, cold and sharp, went through her. This was no place for a woman alone, a woman whose only armor was her faith. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles, swung the door open. End of the line. Miss. Eleanor gathered her small satchel and stepped down. The heat struck her like a physical blow. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky. She looked down the town's single, wide street, a saloon, grander than any other building, squatted on one side, its bat-wing doors swinging lazily. Across from it stood a general store, its windows clouded with dust. Further on, a livery, a barber, and a few nondescript structures baked in the heat, and at the very end of the street, set slightly apart, was a blacksmith's forge. A rhythmic, powerful clang of hammer on steel echoed from it, a lonely heartbeat in the oppressive silence. It was the only sign of diligent work she could see. She clutched her bag, its contents her entire life, a few changes of clothes, a book of poetry, and the letters from the town council, such as it was, promising a room and a modest stipend for a teacher. They wanted their children to read and write. The letter had said, it was a noble ambition, a flicker of light in what felt like a gathering dark. That flicker was why she had come. She was an orphan, raised on the charity of the church, and this was her chance to repay that debt, to bring a small piece of the order and grace she had known to a place that had none. Her gaze drifted back to the forge. A man stood silhouetted against the hellish orange glow within. He was tall and broad, his movements economical and powerful as he drew a piece of metal from the fire, laid it on the anvil, and brought his hammer down. Sparks flew, brief, defiant stars in the gloom of the smithy. Even from this distance, she could feel the solitude that clung to him like the soot on his leather apron. He didn't look up, didn't seem to notice the stagecoach's arrival or her presence. He was a man locked in his own world of fire and iron. That man was Caleb Boone. He had come to Dry Creek 3 years ago, a ghost from a war that the rest of the country was trying to forget. He had ridden with Forrest's cavalry, seen things that had burned the softness from his eyes and replaced it with a permanent watchfulness. He spoke little, drank alone when he drank at all, and worked with a relentless fury, as if trying to hammer his memories into a different shape. The town left him be. He was useful. He could shoe a horse, mend a wagon wheel, and forge a plowshare strong enough to break the stubborn earth. But they sensed the coiled stillness in him, the quiet danger of a man who had been pushed past his limits and survived. The deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes were not from age, but from what he had witnessed. He was a man who had lost his faith in everything but the heft of his hammer and the heat of his forge. Eleanor found the man who had written to her, a Mr. Abernathy, behind the counter of the general store. He was a small, nervous man with sweat stains under his arms and eyes that perpetually darted toward the door. "Miss Hart," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, We We weren't sure you'd actually come. The Lord's work waits for no one." "Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her voice clearer and steadier than she felt. "I am eager to begin, if you could show me the schoolhouse." Abernathy's gaze flickered. He cleared his throat. "Ah, about that. There's been a small complication." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's Mr. Crow. You see, Silas Crow. He owns the silver mine, owns most everything else, too, when you get right down to it." The name landed in the stuffy air of the store with a dull thud. "Mr. Crow," Eleanor prompted. "He decided the building we'd set aside for you would be better used as a storeroom for the mine. Happened last week. Awfully sudden. The storekeeper wouldn't meet her eyes." He busied himself rearranging a stack of tinned peaches. Eleanor felt her hope, so carefully tended on the long journey, begin to wither. "But the children, your letter spoke of a great need." "The need is still here, Miss. It's just Mr. Crow's needs tend to come first," he sighed. A little puff of dust and resignation. "He controls the water rights. He pays most of the wages. You cross Silas Crow, and you find yourself very thirsty and very poor." The idealism she had carried with her from St. Agnes felt like a fragile, foolish thing. The world, she was discovering, was not governed by prayer and good intentions, but by men like Silas Crow. The clean, simple morality of the convent had no currency here. There was only power, and she had none. "Where might I find this Mr. Crow?" she asked, a new, harder edge to her voice. Abernathy paled. "You don't want to do that. Miss, he's not a man for discussions. He's usually over at the Silver Dollar Saloon. His office is upstairs." Eleanor thanked him, her heart sinking. A saloon. The one place the sisters had warned her was a den of iniquity. The devil's own parlor. Yet it seemed in Dry Creek. It was the seat of power. She secured her room at the boarding house, a small, stifling space that smelled of stale whiskey and sorrow, and left her bag. Then, holding her head high, she walked toward the saloon. As she passed the blacksmith's forge, the hammering stopped. For the first time, she felt eyes on her. She glanced over. Caleb Boone stood in the doorway, wiping his face with a rag. His arms were corded with muscle, his face grimed with soot. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly pale gray, the color of a winter sky. And in their depths, she saw a weariness that went far beyond physical exhaustion. It was a soul-deep fatigue. He watched her walk toward the Silver Dollar, his expression unreadable, and a strange, unwelcome blush rose on her cheeks. It felt as though he could see right through her thin cotton dress to the trembling uncertainty beneath. Caleb watched her go. He'd seen her type before, though not in a place like this. She had the convent look about her, scrubbed clean and full of misplaced faith. She walked like she believed the ground beneath her feet was stable and the sky above was benevolent. He knew better. The ground here was quicksand, and the only thing the sky offered was a relentless sun. He'd seen what places like Dry Creek did to people like her. It either broke them or twisted them into something as hard and ugly as the land itself. He turned back to his fire. It wasn't his concern. He had learned long ago that the surest way to get yourself killed was to get involved in other people's troubles. The Silver Dollar was even worse than Eleanor had imagined. The air was thick with the smell of cheap liquor, unwashed bodies, and despair. Men with hard, empty eyes turned to stare as she entered. A piano in the corner tinkled a tinny, cheerful tune that was grotesquely out of place. She ignored them all, walked to the bar, and asked the bartender where she could find Mr. Crow. The man smirked, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "Up the stairs, but he don't like being disturbed." Eleanor climbed the stairs, each step a small victory over the fear that urged her to turn and run. The door to the office was unmarked. She knocked, her knuckles rapping sharply. "Come in," The voice was deep and laced with impatience. She opened the door. Silas Crow was a large man, not with muscle but with fat. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a diamond pin glittering in his cravat. His face was fleshy and pale, his eyes small and shrewd. Like a pig's, he was looking over a ledger, a half-smoked cigar smoldering in an ashtray beside him. "What is it?" he asked without looking up. "Mr. Crow, my name is Eleanor Hart. I am the new school teacher." He looked up then, and his eyes raked over her. A slow, appraising glance that made her feel soiled. "The teacher," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'd heard you were coming. Wasted trip. I'm afraid town decided it didn't need a school after all." "Mr. Abernathy said you needed the building for storage," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level. "That's right. My silver is a damn sight more valuable than teaching a bunch of brats their letters. This is a town for work, miss, not for books." "The children deserve an education," she insisted. "It is the only way to lift them up, to give them a chance at a better life." Crow laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A better life? Their life is in my mine, their fathers work for me, and they will too. All the education they need is how to follow orders and swing a pickaxe. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm a busy man." He looked back down at his ledger, dismissing her. The finality in his tone was absolute. The dust of Dry Creek was not just on the ground. It was in the souls of men like him, choking out any possibility of growth. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, the tinkling piano from downstairs drifting up like a mocking lullaby. She felt the full weight of the town's name upon her. It was a place where hope ran dry, where kindness was a forgotten language. She had come here to plant a garden and had found herself in a desert ruled by a man who hoarded all the water. She turned and left without another word. As she descended the stairs and pushed her way out of the saloon's oppressive atmosphere back into the searing heat, she saw the blacksmith again. He was leaning against the frame of his forge, watching the saloon. Watching her, their eyes met again across the dusty street. This time, she saw something flicker in his gaze, not pity, but a kind of grim understanding. He knew what she had just faced. He knew the man in that room. He knew this town. For the first time since leaving the convent, Eleanor felt an unexpected kinship, not with the pious, church-going folk she had expected, but with this silent, solitary man, this blacksmith who wrestled with fire and steel at the edge of town. They were opposites, she, a vessel of faith and idealism. He, a man burned out by the world's brutalities. Yet, in that shared glance, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. They were both outsiders in this town of dust and drought, two different kinds of survivors in a place that tried its best to grind everything pure and hopeful into the dirt. As she walked back to her lonely room, the rhythmic clang of his hammer started up again, a steady, defiant sound that seemed to say, "Against all odds, I am still here." And Eleanor, clutching the small, smooth cross in her pocket, whispered a prayer that she could say the same. Defeat was a bitter taste, one Eleanor had never known within the cloistered walls of St. Agnes. She did not, however, surrender to it. Faith, she had been taught, was not a shield against hardship, but a light to carry through it. If there was no schoolhouse, she would make one. She spent the next day petitioning the town's few families, her voice earnest, her gaze direct. She spoke to tired-faced mothers in dusty yards and wary fathers outside the general store. She proposed holding classes in the small, unused vestry of the circuit preacher's church, a humble, clapboard building that baked in the sun. Some met her with weary apathy, others with a flicker of interest, but all of them glanced nervously over their shoulders, as if expecting Silas Crow himself to materialize from the dust devils dancing down the street. Her persistence yielded a small, fragile victory. A handful of parents agreed, their hope warring with their fear. On the third morning, Eleanor stood before a motley group of 6 children in the stuffy, sun-slanted vestry. She had a piece of slate, a few nubbins of chalk, and a belief so fierce it felt like a fire in her chest. Caleb Boone heard the sound of children's voices reciting their letters, a strange and unfamiliar music drifting from the church. He paused, his hammer hovering over a glowing horseshoe. He had expected the little convent girl to be on the next stagecoach out, her faith packed away like a Sunday dress. Yet here she was, defying Silas Crow in her own quiet way. He grunted, a sound of reluctant admiration, and brought the hammer down with a sharp, ringing blow. Foolishness, he told himself. It was brave foolishness, the kind that got people hurt. The school, small as it was, did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, a boy swaggered into the vestry, interrupting Eleanor's lesson on long division. He was perhaps 12 years old, dressed in clothes too fine for Dry Creek, with a contemptuous curl to his lip that was a perfect echo of his father's. A silver-headed cane, a ridiculous affectation for a boy his age, was tucked under his arm. "This is it," the boy said, his voice loud and dismissive. He kicked at one of the wooden benches. "This is the school." Eleanor placed her chalk down. "May I help you?" she asked, her tone even. "My father sent me. He said I'm to be your student." He looked around at the other children, a collection of miners' offspring in their patched and faded clothes. As if they were insects. "I am Wyatt, Wyatt Crow." The name fell into the room, and the other children instinctively shrank back. Eleanor's heart steeled itself. So this was the next move in the game. Crow could not shut her down, so he would seek to control her from within. "All are welcome here, Wyatt, so long as they are willing to learn and show respect to others," she said, her words clear and deliberate. Wyatt laughed. "Respect? My father says respect is something you buy. He's paying you, isn't he?" "No one is paying me. Wyatt, the church has graciously allowed us the use of this room." "Then you're a charity case," he sneered. "Teaching other charity cases." He pointed his cane at a small girl in the front row who had a hair lip. "What can you possibly teach her how to hide her face better?" A collective gasp went through the small room. The little girl's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. A cold, clean anger rose in Eleanor, an emotion so pure and strong it burned away her fear. "That is enough," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "In this room, we do not use our words as weapons. We use them to build, to learn, and to understand. You will apologize to Marianne this instant." Wyatt stared at her, genuinely shocked. No one in Dry Creek spoke to him that way. "Apologize to her." "You will apologize," Eleanor repeated, "or you will leave and not return." For a moment, they were locked in a battle of wills, his youthful arrogance against her unshakable conviction. He glared at her, his face flushing with anger. Then he spun on his heel. "My father will hear about this. You'll be teaching lessons to the lizards in the desert by this time tomorrow." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly, and went to comfort the weeping girl. The other children watched her, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. No one stood up to a crow. True to his word, Wyatt told his father. That evening, as Eleanor left the church, Silas Crow himself was waiting for her, leaning against the hitching post. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice deceptively pleasant. "My son tells me you threw him out of your little Bible class." "Your son was cruel to another child. Mr. Crow, I asked him to apologize. He refused." Cruel Crow chuckled. The boy was being honest. "This is a hard world. Miss, it's better that girl learns her place sooner rather than later. Weakness is a liability. My son understands that. It's a lesson you ought to teach." "The only lesson I teach is that of decency and knowledge." "Mr. Crow, your son is welcome back when he is prepared to learn it." Crow's pleasant demeanor vanished. His eyes narrowed. Let's be clear. You are here on my sufferance. This town, this building, the very air you breathe, it's all mine. I offered you a chance. Teach my son. Give him some polish, and I might have found you a proper schoolhouse. But you chose to insult me. You chose to stand on your little pillar of righteousness. He took a step closer, his bulk blocking out the fading light. The town council's support for your lodging at the boarding house has been withdrawn, effective immediately. I expect you to be gone from Dry Creek by morning. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The threat was as cold and heavy as the silver he pulled from the ground. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the long shadows of the setting sun. The promise of expulsion was a death sentence in this wilderness. She had nowhere to go. From the deep gloom of his forge across the street, Caleb had seen it all. He had seen the boy storm out of the church, had seen Crow waiting for her, had watched their confrontation. He couldn't hear the words, but he didn't need to. He knew the language of intimidation. He saw the way Crow moved, the way she stood her ground, and the way she seemed to deflate. Just for a second, when Crow walked away, something inside him, a rusty, corroded mechanism, lurched into motion. He saw her standing there, a lone figure in a plain dress, her shoulders squared against the twilight. And he didn't just see a naive teacher. He saw his wife, Sarah, standing on their porch in Georgia, her face set with that same quiet defiance as she told a Union quartermaster he would not take their last sow. They had taken it anyway, and later they had taken much more. The memory was a hot poker to his soul. He had been a soldier then, miles away, unable to protect his own. Now, he was just a blacksmith, and his first, last, and only instinct was to stay out of it. Trouble was a magnet, and he was made of iron. Getting involved meant bringing his world of violence and loss into hers, and she was too clean for that. He was a tainted man. The best way he could protect her was to stay away. He turned back to the cooling forge, his jaw tight, angry at her for stirring up ghosts he had worked so hard to lay. The next morning, Eleanor packed her small satchel, her hands moving with a slow, deliberate numbness. She had failed. She had come with such high hopes, only to be broken against the rocks of one man's greed and cruelty. Kneeling by her bed for her morning prayers, she felt a profound emptiness. Her rosary beads felt like cold, useless stones in her hand. Her Bible, with its promises of deliverance, felt like a book of lies. As she stood up, her skirt caught on the corner of her travel trunk, and a small, wooden crucifix she kept on a cord around her neck snagged and snapped. The delicate corpus broke from the cross. It fell to the floorboards with a soft, final clatter. She stared at the two pieces, a symbol of her own fractured faith. It was too much. The small, personal loss, on top of everything else, undid her. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She picked up the pieces, the smooth wood of the cross and the tiny, carved figure of the Christ. It was broken, like her spirit, like this town. Then an idea took hold, born of desperation. There was one person in Dry Creek who mended what was broken. She walked down the street, each step an act of will. The sun was already beginning its assault. The town was waking up, but no one met her eye. News traveled fast in a place this small. They knew she had been cast out. She was already a ghost. She stopped before the wide, dark mouth of the blacksmith's forge. The clang of the hammer was steady. She hesitated, clutching the two small pieces of wood in her palm until they dug into her skin. Finally, she stepped out of the blinding sun and into the cool, cavernous space. It was a world of shadows and firelight. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. Tools of a violent constructive trade hung on the walls, tongs, hammers, files of every size. Caleb Boone stood before his anvil, his back to her. He was hammering a length of iron, his movements fluid and certain. The muscles in his back and shoulders shifted under his sweat-dampened shirt. He was a man made of the same elements he commanded: fire, iron, and relentless force. He must have sensed her presence. He finished his strike, plunged the glowing metal into the slack tub with a furious hiss of steam, and turned. His pale gray eyes, startling in his soot-streaked face. Found her. He said nothing, simply waited. Eleanor's voice was a small thing in the vast, echoing space. "Mr. Boone." He nodded, his gaze dropping to her hand. She held it out, opening her palm to reveal the broken crucifix. "It's broken," she said, the words feeling foolish and inadequate. I was wondering if you could fix it. I can't pay you until... well, I cannot pay you, but I would be most grateful." He looked from the broken pieces in her hand to her face. He saw the tear track on her cheek, the exhaustion in her eyes, the tremor in her hand. This was not the self-assured woman who had marched into the saloon. This was what was left after Silas Crow was done with you. The sight of her quiet despair did what her courage had not. It breached his defenses. He saw a plea not just to mend a piece of wood, but to fix something much larger. He reached out and gently took the 2 pieces from her palm. His calloused, grimy fingers were surprisingly gentle against her skin. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. "It's wood," he said, his voice a low rumble, "and small. This needs glue or a fine pin, not a forge hammer." "Oh," she said, her hope crumbling. "I'm sorry to have bothered you." She started to turn away, but his voice stopped her. "But I have a drill for fitting pins. And glue." He looked at the tiny, intricate carving of the corpus. "It's fine work. It was a gift from the Mother Superior when I left the convent." She whispered, "It's all I have of them." He looked at her then, a long, searching look. He saw the stark honesty in her deep brown eyes, the genuine pain of her loss. She wasn't just a symbol of a faith he'd discarded. She was a young woman, alone and adrift, clinging to the last remnant of the only home she had ever known. And he, a man who had made it his business not to care about anyone, found that he did. "Leave it with me," he said gruffly. "Come back in an hour." It was a dismissal, but it was also a promise. It was an anchor in the shifting sands of her world. An hour. He had given her an hour's reprieve from being cast out into the wilderness. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said, a genuine gratitude welling up in her. He just grunted in response and turned back to his workbench, carefully placing the 2 delicate pieces on a clean rag, away from the grime and fury of his usual work. As Eleanor stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, she felt a tiny, fragile seed of hope begin to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. A silent cord had been strung between the 2 most unlikely people in Dry Creek, the woman of faith and the faithless man, the teacher who had lost her school and the blacksmith who mended broken things. An hour later, to the minute, Eleanor stood once more at the entrance to the forge. The fury of the work had subsided, replaced by a quieter, more meticulous energy. Caleb was at his workbench, his broad back bent over a small, precise task. He didn't seem to be using a hammer, but rather a tiny file and a pair of pliers. He heard her approach and turned, his movements unhurried. In his large, soot-stained palm lay the crucifix, whole again. He had not merely glued it. She could see where he had drilled an infinitesimally small hole through the wood and the corpus, inserting a sliver of metal pin so fine it was nearly invisible. It was stronger now than it had been before. The work was that of a watchmaker, not a blacksmith, a display of hidden delicacy that seemed at odds with the powerful man before her. "Mr. Boone," she breathed, her voice filled with a reverence that surprised her. "It's perfect." He placed it in her outstretched hand. His fingers brushed against hers again, calloused and warm. "The pin should hold," he said, his voice a low rumble that was almost a dismissal. He turned back to his work, as if the transaction was finished and her presence no longer required. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked, her fingers closing around the mended cross. He didn't turn around. No payment needed, he said to the wall of tools. Consider it a professional courtesy. We both work with stubborn materials. She understood he was not just talking about wood and iron. She clutched the crucifix, a small, solid piece of hope in a world that had offered none, and walked back toward the boarding house. She did not know that Caleb watched her go from the corner of his eye, his expression a mixture of grimness and something else, something he refused to name. He saw Mrs. Gable, the harried owner of the boarding house, intercept her on the porch. He saw the woman's anxious wringing of her hands, the apologetic but firm set of her jaw. He knew Crow had gotten to her. He watched Eleanor's shoulders slump, the brief flicker of hope he'd just given her extinguished, and the rusty gear inside his chest groaned and turned another notch. He let 10 minutes pass, then he banked his fire and walked across the street. He found Mrs. Gable in her kitchen, weeping into a dish rag. "He'll ruin me. Caleb," she sobbed, not even surprised to see him. "Crow will. He owns the building. He said if she's not out by noon, he'll double my rent." Caleb's face was a stone mask. He pulled a few worn bills from his pocket and placed them on the table. That should cover the woman's room for tonight. And tomorrow. Mrs. Gable stared at the money. "I can't take this. If Crow finds out—" "He won't," Caleb said, and there was a quiet finality in his tone that was more threatening than any of Crow's bluster. "She stays. Tell her there was a misunderstanding with the council. Tell her whatever you like. But she stays." He looked at the woman's tear-streaked face. "Some things are worth more than rent. Martha." He turned and left before she could argue. Eleanor, upstairs in her room, was preparing to leave when Mrs. Gable knocked. The woman offered a flustered, unconvincing story about a miscommunication, and that the town council, or at least a charitable member of it, had covered her lodging for another few days. Eleanor was exhausted enough to accept the flimsy explanation, too tired to question the small miracle. She only felt a profound, weary gratitude. As the day bled into a long, suffocating afternoon, the sky began to change. The relentless blue faded to a bruised purple gray. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. The wind began to moan, a low, mournful sound that picked up dust and stray leaves, swirling them in frantic eddies down the main street. A storm was coming. Not a gentle, life-giving rain, but a brawl of a storm, the kind that tore things apart. By nightfall, the sky opened. Rain came down not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the dust of Dry Creek into a thick, clinging mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so violent it seemed to split the heavens, followed by jagged spears of lightning that bleached the world white for a terrifying heartbeat. The boarding house groaned under the assault. Inside, the oil lamps flickered, their flames dancing like frantic spirits. Eleanor sat on her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had never been afraid of storms at the convent, where the thick stone walls offered a sense of eternal security. But here, in this flimsy wooden building, she felt terribly exposed, a small, fragile thing in the face of the world's rage. Caleb was in his own room down the hall, stripped to the waist, washing the day's grime from his face and arms in a basin of cold water. He had worked late, taking on an extra job mending a broken axle for a freight wagon, his body aching with a familiar, welcome fatigue. The storm was a fitting soundtrack to the temper of his own soul. He felt a grim satisfaction in its power, its raw and honest violence, a relief from the sly, cruel machinations of men like Crow. Work in the forge was a constant battle with heat and soot. The fine black dust worked its way into every pore, under every nail, a permanent layer of grit that never truly washed away. A full bath was a rare luxury, requiring the heating of several buckets of water on the kitchen stove, a chore most were too tired for. But tonight, Caleb needed it. He needed to feel clean. He needed to wash away the memory of the compromise he had made, the money he had spent to involve himself, however slightly, in the teacher's fate. He needed to wash away the look in her eyes when she had held up that broken crucifix. He hauled the large wooden tub into the center of his small room, filled it with the steaming water, and sank into its depths with a groan of relief. The heat seeped into his tired muscles, a comforting balm. Steam rose around him, clouding the small mirror on the wall and softening the harsh lines of the room. For a few moments, with the storm raging outside and the hot water enveloping him, he could almost forget where he was. He could almost forget who he was. It was then that the lamps in the hallway and in his room sputtered and died. The wind had found a way into the chimney, extinguishing the flames. The boarding house was plunged into absolute, disorienting blackness. Eleanor, startled by the sudden dark, stood up. A shutter on her window had come loose and was banging against the building with a frantic, percussive rhythm that grated on her nerves. She felt her way to the window, intending to latch it, but a particularly violent gust of wind blew the door to her room shut with a resounding crack. When she turned back, she was utterly lost. The darkness was total, a thick, velvety blanket that smothered all sense of direction. She reached out, her hands finding the wall. She thought she was heading for the door she'd just come through. She moved slowly, shuffling her feet, her heart thumping in time with the banging shutter. Her hand found a doorknob. This is it, she thought, relieved. She turned the knob and pushed the door open, stepping through. The air was different here, warm, humid, and filled with the clean scent of lye soap. She took another step, her hands outstretched, and then a flash of lightning illuminated the entire world. For a single, silent, eternal second, she saw him, a man in a tub of water, his shoulders and chest, broad and powerful, slick with moisture. His head was thrown back, his eyes closed. The lightning caught the beads of water on his skin, making them glitter like diamonds. It carved his face out of the darkness, a study in harsh angles and weary lines. It was the blacksmith, Mr. Boone. Her mind simply stopped working. The sight was so alien, so intimate, so far beyond the realm of her experience that her brain could not process it. The warmth she felt on the air was not just steam. It was the warmth of life itself, a raw masculine energy she had never encountered. It was like accidentally stumbling upon a secret, elemental fire. Caleb's eyes snapped open at the sound of the door. He saw her at the same instant the lightning struck, freezing her in its stark white glare. She was standing in his doorway, her hand still on the knob, her face a pale oval of utter shock. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and framed her face in soft waves. In that flash of divine light, she looked like an avenging angel or a lost soul, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely innocent. He saw in her everything he had ever fought for and everything he had ever lost. She was the embodiment of a world before the fall, a world of clean hands and clear consciences, a world that no longer had a place for men like him. The thunder that followed the lightning was a deafening roar, but in the small, steamy room, the silence was even louder. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. He was trapped by the shock of her purity. She by the shock of his presence. It was a collision of two worlds, the convent and the battlefield, faith and cynicism, innocence and a bitter, hard-won experience. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. Then it shattered. Eleanor made a small, strangled sound in the back of her throat. She stumbled backward, pulling the door shut with a click that sounded as loud as a gunshot in the stillness. She fled down the hall, her stocking feet making no sound on the floorboards, her mind a screaming chaos of shame and confusion. In her panicked flight, a small silk scarf tucked into the waistband of her skirt, caught on the iron latch of the door. It pulled free and drifted, silent and unnoticed, to the floor outside his room. She found her own door and scrambled inside, slamming it shut and leaning against it, her body trembling uncontrollably. She pressed her hands to her burning face. The image from the lightning flash seared onto the inside of her eyelids. She felt tainted, ashamed, as though she had committed a terrible sin by accident. In his room, Caleb remained motionless in the rapidly cooling water. The storm outside continued its assault, but the storm inside him was far more violent. Her appearance had been like a lightning strike to his own soul, illuminating all the dark, ruined corners he kept hidden. He felt a profound sense of sacrilege, as though his own grimy existence had sullied her just by being seen. After a long time, he rose from the tub. He moved mechanically, drying himself, pulling on his trousers. The water had not cleansed him. He felt dirtier than before. He opened his door, intending to, he didn't know what, to make sure she was all right, to see if the ghost was still there. And then he saw it, a small pool of pale silk on the dark floorboards. He bent down and picked it up. It was soft, impossibly so, against his rough fingers. He lifted it. It was a simple scarf, but it held a scent. It was not the perfume of a saloon girl or the cloying sweetness of a society lady. It was the clean, unassuming fragrance of wildflowers and sun-dried linen, of lavender and chamomile. It was the scent of the convent garden, the scent of innocence. It was her. He closed his fist around the soft fabric. The scent, a ghost in the air. The image of her face, pale and shocked in the lightning flash, was burned into his memory. He knew he could not return the scarf. To do so would be to acknowledge the moment, to force her to speak of it, and he could not bring himself to cause her that further shame. He stood there for a long time in the dark hallway, the storm dying down outside, clutching the small piece of silk. It was a tangible piece of her world, a world he had thought forever lost to him. It was a whisper of light in his endless dark, a scent of grace in a town without mercy. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never forget it. Her scent had found a permanent place in the ruins of his soul, and he knew, in that same instant, that he could not let her be driven from this town. He would not stand by and watch the world break one more good thing. Her scent stayed, a quiet promise. So did he. The morning after the storm broke clear and cruelly bright, as if the sky were mocking the turmoil on the ground. Dry Creek was a sea of mud, and the air, washed clean of dust, smelled of wet earth and bruised sage. Eleanor did not leave her room. She could not. The memory of the night before played over and over in her mind, a series of lightning flash images that made her cheeks burn with a shame so profound it felt like a fever. She had seen a man in his most private moment. She, who had been taught that the body was a temple to be kept sacred and unseen, had stumbled into its most vulnerable sanctum. She spent the morning on her knees, not praying, but trying to. The words would not come. Her faith felt like a distant shore she could no longer reach. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, the slick, powerful lines of his shoulders, the water beating on his skin, the weary set of his jaw. The image was not just shameful. It was disturbingly, terrifyingly human. It had stripped away the soot and the silence, revealing the man beneath, a man as weary and wounded as any she had read about in the tragedies of old. Down the hall, Caleb Boone dressed in the gray morning light, his movements stiff. He had not slept. He had sat in a chair by his window, the small silk scarf in his hand, its impossible softness a stark contrast to the calluses on his palms, its clean scent, a ghost in his stale room. He felt as if he had been caught in a crime, though he was the one who had been seen. He had contaminated her with his presence, his sheer, unadorned existence. He tucked the scarf into the bottom of his worn saddlebag, a secret relic, a piece of evidence from a crime that had no name. When he went to the forge, he worked with a cold, contained fury. the blows of his hammer on the anvil ringing out with a frantic, percussive rhythm that was an echo of his own tormented thoughts. He was a fool for helping her, a fool for giving her a reason to stay one more night. He should have let Crow run her out. It would have been a kindness. This place and men like him would only ruin her. The ruin began in the most ordinary of ways. Mrs. Gable, sweeping mud from the boarding house porch, was speaking with Mrs. Abernathy from the general store. Mrs. Gable. Her nerves still frayed from the storm, and her conscience pricked by the lie she had told Eleanor about the rent, needed to unburden herself. "A terrible night," she said, leaning on her broom. The wind blew open the door to Mr. Boone's room, and the teacher's too. Such a clatter and a banging, and the lamps all went out at once, found them both wide open this morning. It was a small, innocuous observation, but in the fertile soil of Dry Creek's boredom and suspicion, it was a seed. Mrs. Abernathy, a woman whose piety was exceeded only by her love of gossip, took that seed with her back to the store. By the time her husband returned from the saloon for his lunch, the seed had sprouted. "They say the new teacher was in the blacksmith's room last night," she whispered to him over the counter. "During the storm, in the dark." By mid-afternoon, the sprout had become a thorny vine, wrapping itself around the town. The story was told and retold, each telling adding a new, more lurid detail. The doors weren't just blown open. She was seen sneaking out. They weren't just in the same room, they were heard. The fine, delicate fabric of Eleanor's reputation was being systematically unraveled by the town's idle, malicious tongues. Silas Crow heard the rumor in the Silver Dollar Saloon and recognized its value instantly. It was a gift, a weapon far more effective than eviction notices or withdrawn funds. He could destroy not just her position, but her very essence. He bought a round of drinks for the men at the bar. "A toast," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "to our new school teacher, a woman of such hidden devotions. Seems she's more interested in teaching the blacksmith the good book than teaching our children their ABCs. A round of coarse laughter followed. The story, now bearing the stamp of Crow's approval, became fact. It hardened from malicious whisper to accepted truth. The teacher, the little convent girl who walked with her eyes to the heavens, was a hypocrite. She was no better than the painted women who worked in the rooms above the saloon. She was worse, in fact, because she hid her sin behind a mask of piety. The first sign of the poison's spread came that afternoon when Eleanor, forcing herself to leave her room, went to the church vestry. None of her 6 students were there. She waited for an hour in the silent, empty room, the unused chalk a heavy weight in her hand. Finally, she walked to the small house of one of her pupils, a quiet girl named Sarah. The girl's mother, a woman who had previously been so grateful, met her at the door, her face a mask of cold disapproval. "Sarah won't be coming to your lessons anymore, Miss Hart," the woman said, refusing to meet Eleanor's eyes. "We don't want her exposed to certain influences." "Influences?" Eleanor asked, her voice faltering. "I don't understand." "I think you do," the woman said, and closed the door in her face. The same scene was repeated at 2 other houses. The message was clear. She was no longer a teacher. She was a contagion. As she walked back down the main street, the weight of the town's judgment was a physical force. Women who had nodded to her yesterday now turned their backs. Men outside the saloon stopped talking as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of leering curiosity and contempt. She was alone, utterly and completely, in a way she had never been even as an orphan. She was an outcast. Caleb heard the talk. He heard it from a freighter whose wagon he was mending. He heard it from Abernathy when he went to the store for a sack of flour. He saw the smirks and the knowing glances, the raw, ugly words bathed together. Sinful blacksmith, church teacher were like hammer blows to his gut. They were taking something clean and dragging it through the filth of their own small, mean lives. His first instinct was to burn the whole town down. His second more practical one, was to find the source. But he knew it didn't matter. A rumor like this had no single source. It was a fire fed by everyone. That evening, in the Silver Dollar, he saw a group of miners, emboldened by Crow's whiskey, making crude jokes at her expense. A young, loudmouthed man named Finn drew a caricature of a woman in a bonnet and a man with a hammer in a bathtub on the dusty bar top. Caleb moved before he thought. He didn't say a word. He crossed the room, grabbed Finn by the collar, and slammed him against the wall. The saloon went silent. Finn's eyes were wide with terror. "Wipe it off," Caleb said, his voice a low, deadly growl. Finn, trembling, scrambled to do as he was told, smearing the crude drawing with his sleeve. "The next man who speaks the teacher's name without respect," Caleb said, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces, "will be picking his teeth up from the floorboards with a broken hand." He released Finn, who slumped to the floor, and walked out. The act was meant to be a defense, a drawing of a line in the sand, but to the town, it was a confession. Only a guilty man would react with such violence. Only a lover would be so protective. His defense of her honor had, in their eyes, sealed her damnation. Eleanor was in her room when the circuit preacher, Reverend Michael, knocked on her door. He was a kind man, but his spine was made of willow. He entered, twisting his hat in his hands, his face a study in pious misery. "Miss Hart," he began, his gaze fixed on the floor, "I have come on a difficult errand. There are stories circulating, unpleasant stories." "They are lies?" "Reverend," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. Perhaps, he said quickly. "But in a small community, the appearance of sin can be as damaging as the sin itself. Mr. Crow has spoken to me. He feels your presence is a moral detriment to the town. He has made it clear that if you remain, his donations to the church, which are our very lifeblood, will cease." Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. So he is using God's house as a tool for his own vengeance. "He is a powerful man, my dear," the Reverend sighed. "And your reputation, it has been grievously wounded. The parents have withdrawn their children. The church board feels perhaps it would be for the best, for everyone involved. If you were to leave Dry Creek, allow this unfortunate scandal to fade." Here it was, the choice. She could leave. She could take the morning stagecoach and never look back. She could return to the cool, clean world of the convent, confess her part in the accident, do her penance, and her honor, in time, would be restored. She could erase Dry Creek from her life. Or she could stay. She could stay and fight for the tattered remnants of her name in a town that had already judged and convicted her. She could stay for the handful of children who needed her, even if their parents had turned against her. She could stay and face the whispers, the stares, the loneliness, all for a principle that no one else here seemed to value. To leave was to save herself. To stay was to save the very idea of what she had come here to do. Caleb was wrestling with his own demons in the dark of the forge. He had made things worse. He had wrapped her in the filthy blanket of his own reputation. He was like a man with plague trying to save someone from a common cold. His very touch was a contagion. He should leave her be. He should let her go. He knew it was the safest thing for her. He had failed to protect Sarah from the horrors of war. He would surely fail to protect this delicate woman of God from the petty cruelties of this town. Every instinct for self-preservation, every lesson learned in blood and loss, screamed at him to turn his back, to retreat into the world of fire and steel where he was master, where emotions and loyalties could not reach him. But then he remembered the look on her face when he had handed her the mended crucifix. He remembered her standing alone and defiant against Silas Crow. He remembered her face in the lightning, an image of terrified innocence. He pulled the silk scarf from his saddlebag. He held it to his face, inhaling the faint, clean scent. It was the smell of a better world, a world he had thought was gone forever. To let her be driven out would be to admit that world was truly dead. It would be to let Silas Crow and his kind win, not just over her, but over the last flickering ember of hope within his own soul. To protect her was to risk destroying her, but to abandon her was to risk destroying himself. Late that night, Eleanor knelt by her bed. This time, the prayers came. They were not pleas for deliverance, but for strength. She prayed for the courage to endure shame, for the faith to see a purpose in her suffering. She held the mended crucifix in her hand. The tiny, invisible pin Caleb had placed within it, a secret source of strength. It was a reminder that even things that are broken can be made whole and stronger than before. When she rose to her feet, her choice was made. Her honor was not a fragile thing to be protected by running away. It was a fire to be tended. Even in the harshest wind, her purpose was not to be liked, but to serve. And she would not be driven from that purpose by whispers and lies. She would stay. She would open the vestry door tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. She would be there for any child brave enough to come. She would face the town not with defiance, but with a quiet, unshakable grace. She would not let the darkness of Dry Creek extinguish her small light. Eleanor kept her word. The next morning, and the morning after that, she walked to the church vestry, opened the door, and waited. The room remained empty, silent save for the buzzing of a fly against the single window pane and the sound of her own steady breathing. The town watched her daily, pointless pilgrimage with a mixture of scorn and pity. She was a ghost tending a graveyard, a teacher with no students, a woman clinging to a purpose that had been publicly stripped from her. Yet, she persisted. Her quiet, stubborn presence was an act of defiance more powerful than any shouted argument. It was a refusal to be erased. Caleb watched her too, from the shadows of his forge. Each morning she walked past, her back straight, her bonnet perfectly tied, and each morning his respect for her grew, warring with his fear for her safety. She was chipping away at the town's solid wall of contempt with the most unlikely of tools' patience. On the third day, something changed. As Eleanor sat alone in the vestry, the door creaked open. Mary Ann, the little girl with the hair lip, stood hesitantly on the threshold. Behind her were two other children, a pair of grimy-faced brothers whose father worked the deepest, most dangerous shift in Crow's mine. They looked like frightened rabbits, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. "My ma said not to come," Mary Ann whispered, clutching a tattered primer to her chest. "But I want to learn the words." Eleanor's heart swelled with a feeling so fierce and bright it almost brought tears to her eyes. This was not defeat. This was a secret victory, a small, brave insurrection against the town's cruelty. "Then you are in the right place. Mary Ann," she said, her voice soft. "Come in, all of you." The secret school began. Every morning, a small handful of children, the outcasts, the overlooked, the ones whose parents were too beaten down by life to care what Crow thought would slip into the church one by one. They learned their sums on a shared slate and sounded out words in a hushed chorus. It was a tiny flicker of light in a town determined to live in the dark. Caleb noticed the children slipping in and out of the church. He recognized the defiance in their small shoulders, the same defiance he saw in Eleanor's walk. One afternoon, he saw that the iron hinge on the heavy vestry door was rusted and strained. On the pretext of offering his services to the Reverend, he brought his tools to the church. He worked slowly, meticulously, cleaning and oiling the hinge. It gave him an excuse to be near, to stand as a silent, unacknowledged guardian at the gate of their small sanctuary. He was inside, packing his tools. When the children's lesson was ending, he listened to Eleanor's gentle voice as she praised a grubby little boy for correctly spelling water. The sound was so foreign in his world of ringing steel and harsh memories that it felt like a balm. Silas Crow was not a patient man. His campaign of shame had failed. The teacher was still here. Worse, he'd heard whispers of her secret classes. It was a personal affront, a challenge to his absolute authority. His public humiliation of her had not been enough. She needed a lesson, a final, unequivocal message that this was his town, and her brand of hope had no place in it. He summoned Finn and Jeb, his two most reliable enforcers, to his office above the saloon. Finn was still smarting from his public humiliation at Caleb's hands. Jeb was a mountain of a man who rarely spoke and whose fists did his talking for him. "The church," Crow said, swirling brandy in a glass. "The little room she uses, it's a fire trap. Dry old wood. It would be a tragedy if a lamp were to be knocked over this evening." "A real tragedy." He looked at them, his piggy eyes cold and flat. "See to it there's a tragedy. After the children have gone home. I want to scare her, not make martyrs of them. Burn it, burn her little school to the ground. Let's see how righteous she feels when she has nothing left but ashes."
That evening, the lesson ran late. The children were excited, having finally mastered a difficult passage in their reader, and Eleanor didn't have the heart to rush them. Caleb, making a final check on the hinge, lingered in the back of the church, the quiet hum of their learning a welcome respite from the forge. Outside, in the deep twilight, Finn and Jeb crept toward the vestry. They didn't see the children's worn boots still lined up by the door. They only saw the single lamp burning in the window, a perfect target, with swift, practiced movements. They splashed kerosene along the base of the wooden wall beneath the window, the acrid smell sharp on the cool night air. Finn struck a match. He hesitated for a second, then tossed it. The old, dry wood erupted with a hungry whoosh. Flames, orange and yellow, clawed their way up the side of the building with terrifying speed. Inside, the first sign of trouble was the smell, sharp and chemical, followed by an angry orange light that flickered beneath the door. Caleb smelled it first. It was the scent of coal oil and something else, something burning that shouldn't be. He was on his feet in an instant, his soldier's instincts screaming. "Out," he yelled, his voice a thunderclap that shocked the children into silence. "Everyone out, now!" He threw open the door to the main church, but a wall of thick, black smoke and blistering heat drove them back. The fire was already consuming the front of the building, cutting off their escape. Panic erupted. The children began to cry, their small faces pale with terror in the flickering, hellish light. Eleanor, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, moved to them. "It's all right," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Mister, Boone will get us out. Stay with me." Caleb was already at the back of the vestry, tearing at the boards nailed over the single small window. It was their only hope. The wood was old but strong, the nails long and deep. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with the effort, the muscles in his back straining. Smoke was pouring into the room now, thick and acrid, stealing the air from their lungs. The heat was becoming unbearable. Eleanor was outside, having stayed a moment after the children to straighten the books. She saw the first flicker of flames and smelled the kerosene. For a heartbeat, she was frozen in disbelief. Then a wave of pure, cold terror washed over her. The children, Caleb, they were inside. She didn't scream. She didn't run for help. She ran toward the fire. The front of the church was an inferno. She circled to the back, her lungs burning from the smoke, her eyes streaming. She saw the frantic movement at the small back window and heard Caleb's muffled shouts. He finally ripped one of the boards free with a screech of tortured nails. He smashed the window pane with his elbow, heedless of the glass, and began tearing at the remaining boards. The children first, he yelled to Eleanor through the opening. "Take them!" He lifted the smallest of the brothers and passed him through the narrow opening into Eleanor's waiting arms. She grabbed the boy and dragged him away from the burning wall, her hands singed by the heat radiating from the building. One by one, Caleb pushed the terrified, coughing children through the window. Marianne was the last, her dress snagged on a nail, and for a terrifying moment, she was stuck. Caleb reached through, tore the fabric free, and shoved her into Eleanor's arms. "Now you," he yelled, his face black with soot, his eyes wild in the firelight. "Climb through!" Eleanor scrambled to the window, but as she put her hands on the sill, a deep, groaning crack echoed from within. The main roof beam, eaten through by the fire, was giving way. The ceiling above Caleb began to sag, raining down sparks and burning embers. He saw it coming. He saw the look of terror on her face, not for herself, but for him. In that split second, there was no choice. It wasn't even a thought. It was a pure, primal instinct. He lunged forward and shoved her with all his might. Eleanor tumbled backward out of the window, landing hard on the ground just as the roof collapsed with a deafening roar. A shower of sparks and flaming debris erupted from the window where she had been a second before. The entire structure imploded, sending a geyser of fire into the night sky. She lay there for a moment, stunned. The air knocked from her lungs. Then she scrambled to her feet, screaming his name. "Caleb." There was no answer, only the furious crackle and roar of the fire. The town was awake now, people spilling out of their houses and the saloon, their faces lit with a horrified, flickering orange glow. A bucket brigade was forming, a futile gesture against the raging inferno. 2 men pulled Eleanor away from the heat as she tried to run back to the window. Then she saw them. A group of men, their faces grim, were dragging a body from the wreckage near the back wall, where a section had collapsed outward. It was Caleb. He was unconscious, his face and arms blackened, a deep, bloody gash on the side of his head where a beam had struck him. He was terrifyingly still. The world seemed to slow down for Eleanor. The shouts of the men, the roar of the fire, the crying of the children, it all faded into a distant hum. The only thing she could see was Caleb's still form being carried away from the flames. This was not about reputation anymore. It was not about faith or principles. It was about the raw, terrifying fear of loss. She felt something tear loose inside her, a pain so sharp and visceral it took her breath away. They took him to the small room of Doc Miller, whose office was little more than a converted pantry. The doctor, a weary man who had seen too much, cleaned the wounds as best he could. Caleb was alive, but barely. He had severe burns on his arms and back, a broken rib, and the head wound was deep. "He's strong," the doctor told Eleanor, who stood vigil in the corner, refusing to leave. "But the fever will be the test, if he can fight off the fever." He left the rest unsaid. Eleanor spent the night at his bedside. She dismissed Mrs. Gable's tentative offers of help, ignored the curious, pitying stares of the townspeople who gathered outside. This was her place, her responsibility. She gently cleaned the soot from his face with a cool, damp cloth, her touch as light as a prayer. She bathed his burns and bandaged the wound on his head. She sat in the stifling, lamp-lit room, listening to the ragged sound of his breathing, each breath a small victory against the encroaching silence. Sometime after midnight, the fever took hold. He began to toss and turn, his body slick with sweat, and he began to talk. The words were slurred, disconnected, ghosts of another time and place. "The smoke, so thick," he muttered, his hands clenching at the sheets. "Can't see, the barn is burning." Eleanor leaned closer, wiping his brow with the cloth. His eyes, squeezed shut, moved frantically beneath their lids. He was seeing not the burning church, but another fire, long ago. "Sarah!" he cried out, the name a raw, broken thing torn from the depths of his soul. "Sarah, where are you? I can't get to you. The damn Yankees! They fired the barn!" Eleanor froze, the cloth hovering over his forehead. Sarah, his wife. "I'm sorry," he moaned, a sound of pure agony. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have been there. It should have been me. I couldn't save you." And in that moment, in the fevered, broken confession of a dying man, Eleanor finally understood. The wall of silence, the soul-deep weariness in his eyes, the solitude he wrapped around himself like a shroud. It was not a choice, but a prison built of guilt and grief. He wasn't a man who had lost his faith. He was a man who had lost his world and blamed himself for it. His desperate, violent need to protect her wasn't about her at all. It was about Sarah. He was trying to win a battle he had already lost. Years ago, in the smoke and fire of a forgotten war. She looked at his face, no longer just the town blacksmith, but a man drowning in a past he could not escape. Her heart ached with a profound, shattering empathy. She gently took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. It was a small, simple gesture, but in the quiet, desperate hours of that long night, as she held the hand of the man who had saved her, she finally understood the true meaning of grace. It was not something given by God from on high, but something shared between two broken souls in the dark. The fire changed everything. It burned away more than just the church vestry. It incinerated the town's apathy and cauterized the wound of its fear. In the gray smoke-hazed light of the following day, the smoldering ruin stood as a stark and ugly monument to a line that had been crossed. This was no longer about a teacher's reputation. It was about an attempt on the lives of their children. The first stone in the avalanche against Silas Crow was cast not by a man with a gun, but by a woman with a washboard. It was Mrs. Miller, the mother of the two boys Caleb had passed through the window. She stood in front of the general store, her arms raw from lye soap, and her voice, usually a timid whisper, rang out with the clarity of a bell. "He tried to burn our children," she said to the small crowd that had gathered. "For what? Because a good woman wanted to teach them to read. What kind of a man does that?" Her husband, a stoop-shouldered miner with coal dust etched permanently into the lines of his face, stood beside her. He had seen the terror in his son's eyes, smelled the smoke in their hair, the fear of Crow's power, which had kept him silent and subservient for years, was nothing compared to the fury of a father whose children had been threatened. "Finn and Jeb," he said, his voice a low growl. "They were seen skulking around the church just before it went up. Everyone knows they're Crow's dogs." The words hung in the air, a truth that everyone had known but had been too afraid to speak. The story of the rescue, told and retold by the rescued children themselves, had spread through the town with the speed of the fire itself. They spoke of how Miss Hart had run toward the flames, not away, and how the blacksmith had torn the walls apart with his bare hands, shoving them to safety before the roof fell in on him. Eleanor and Caleb were no longer the town pariahs. They were heroes. Silas Crow, ensconced in his office above the saloon, felt the shift in the town's atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure. He had expected the fire to chasten the teacher, to solidify his power. Instead, it had made her a martyr and turned the town's simmering resentment into open anger. He saw the small, tight knots of men gathering on street corners, their gazes now directed at the saloon with a cold, assessing anger. The real trouble began when an old, half-mad prospector named Silas, who had nursed a grudge against Crow for years, found his courage at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. He staggered out into the street, pointing a trembling finger at the saloon. "He stole my claim," the old man shrieked, his voice cracking. "Years ago said the assay report was worthless, bought it from me for pennies. Then he pulled a river of silver out of it. And my partner, Tom Calloway, he argued with Crow about it. 2 days later, a mine collapse. Tom was the only one who died. It was no collapse. It was murder. The accusation, which would have been dismissed as drunken rambling a week ago, now landed like a lit stick of dynamite. People remembered Tom Calloway. They remembered his quiet, angry widow who had left town with her children shortly after. Crow's cruelty was one thing, murder was another. The town's anger now had a focus, a history. The fire was not an isolated act, but the latest chapter in a long and brutal story of greed. Eleanor, sitting at Caleb's bedside, was oblivious to the storm gathering outside. Her entire world had shrunk to the small, stuffy room, to the rise and fall of Caleb's chest, to the task of keeping the fever at bay. She was no longer just a teacher. She was a nurse, a guardian. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, changing his bandages, spooning cool water between his cracked lips, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice, not caring if he could hear. On the second day, the fever broke. Caleb opened his eyes. They were clear, the fever haze gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary lucidity. He looked at her, and his first word was not a question or a cry of pain. It was just her name, spoken in a hoarse whisper. Eleanor. "I'm here. Caleb," she said, her voice catching. She squeezed the hand she was holding. He knew, in that single word and her simple reply, he knew that she had been there through the fever, that she had heard his delirious confession. He saw no judgment in her eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking compassion. The walls he had spent years building around the memory of Sarah, the guilt he had carried like a physical burden, did not shatter. Instead, it felt as though she had quietly opened a door in them, letting in a sliver of light. Word of Caleb's returning consciousness spread. It emboldened the town. The sheriff, a man named Potter who had long operated as little more than Crow's errand boy, found himself cornered by a delegation of miners. "Are you going to do something?" Sheriff one of them demanded. "Or do we have to do it ourselves, Potter?" A man who prized self-preservation above all else, could see which way the wind was blowing. His loyalty to Crow was a business arrangement. His desire to avoid a riot was a matter of survival. He went to see Crow, his face pale with sweat. "Silas, they're talking about a rope. They say you killed Tom Calloway. They say you set the fire." Crow laughed, but the sound was brittle. "They have no proof. It's the word of a drunk and a few hysterical women." "Proof doesn't matter when a mob gets an idea in its head," Potter said. "You need to lay low. Let this blow over." But Crow's arrogance was a disease. He could not comprehend a world that did not bend to his will. He believed he could crush this rebellion as he had crushed everything else, with money and fear. He was wrong. A week after the fire, Caleb was on his feet. He was weak, his arm was in a sling, and his movements were stiff and painful. But he was ambulatory. His strength, Doc Miller said, was unnatural. Eleanor suspected it had less to do with his body, and more to do with his will. The first thing he did was walk to the ruins of the church. He stood there for a long time, looking at the charred beams and piles of ash. Eleanor stood beside him, not speaking. "He did this," Caleb said. It was not a question. "Yes," she replied. "It stops now," he said. He turned and started walking toward the center of town. His gait was slow, favoring his injured side, but there was an implacable purpose in every step. Crow was on the porch of the saloon, trying to project an air of unconcerned authority. When he saw Caleb coming, Finn and Jeb flanked him, their hands resting near their pistols. The street, which had been bustling moments before, fell silent and empty as people took cover in doorways and alleys. Caleb stopped in the middle of the muddy street, 20 yards from the saloon. He was not wearing a gun. He was a blacksmith, a builder, not a gunslinger. He had left that life behind in the red dirt of Georgia. "Crow!" Caleb's voice was not loud, but it carried in the tense silence. "It's over. You're going to answer for what you did, for the fire, for Tom Calloway." Crow sneered, his confidence returning at the sight of the unarmed, injured man. "You're in no position to make threats. Blacksmith, you should have died in that fire." He nodded to Finn. "Teach him another lesson." Finn drew his pistol, a smirk on his face. He had been waiting for this. He took a step forward, from the doorway of the general store. A rifle shot cracked the silence. Finn cried out, dropping his gun and clutching his hand, a red flower blooming between his fingers. Mr. Abernathy, his face white as a sheet but his hand steady, stood with the smoking rifle. Crow stared, his face a mask of disbelief. The town had turned, his power was an illusion, and it had just evaporated. In a fit of panicked rage, he drew his own pistol, a fancy, silver-inlaid revolver, and fired wildly at Caleb. The shot went wide. Caleb didn't flinch. He just watched as the sheriff, finally choosing his side, stepped out from beside the livery, his own pistol drawn and leveled. "Drop it, Silas, it's done!" But Crow was a cornered animal now. He swung his gun toward the sheriff. Before he could fire, another shot rang out. This one came from Caleb. He had produced a small, business-like pistol from inside his coat, a relic from his past he had kept hidden away. His shot was not aimed to kill. It was precise, efficient. It struck Crow in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the mud. Crow collapsed, howling in pain and shock. It was over. The takedown of Silas Crow was not a blaze of glory, but a sudden, pathetic collapse. The sheriff and his newly deputized citizens took him into custody, along with his whimpering henchmen. The town, for the first time in years, could breathe. In the weeks that followed, Dry Creek began to heal. An investigation into the mine's finances, led by a federal marshal, uncovered years of fraud. Old accounts and suppressed reports confirmed what the prospector had claimed. Silas Crow was taken away in chains, his reign of fear ending not with a bang, but with the clank of a prison door. Eleanor made her choice. She would stay. When she announced her intention to rebuild the school, she did not have to ask for help. It was offered. Mr. Abernathy donated a plot of land behind his store. The miners, on their one day of rest, volunteered their labor, felling timber in the hills. The women organized meals, bringing bread and stew to the building site. The little church vestry had been a secret, fragile thing. The new school was a community project, a barn raising for the town's soul. And at the center of it all was Caleb. Every day, from sunup to sundown, he was there. He refused all help with the most difficult tasks. With his good arm, he squared logs, set foundations, and raised the frame. His hammer, once a tool of his solitary trade, now rang out with a new purpose, a constructive, hopeful sound. He was not just building a school. He was performing an act of penance, a physical prayer. He was rebuilding his own life from the ashes, just as he was rebuilding the school. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mesas, casting long shadows across the half-finished frame of the schoolhouse, Eleanor brought him a cup of water. He was sitting on a stack of lumber, his face weary but peaceful. "You don't have to do this all yourself, you know," she said softly. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers. "Yes, I do," he said, his gaze fixed on the structure. "This is for them, the children." He paused, then looked at her, his pale gray eyes holding an emotion she had never seen in them before. Not gratitude, not guilt, but a kind of quiet, wondering peace. And it's for her, too, for Sarah, to finally build something, instead of just remembering what was burned. Eleanor understood. He was making his peace with the ghosts of his past, not by forgetting them, but by honoring them with a better future. She sat down beside him, and they watched the stars begin to appear in the vast, darkening sky. In the shared, comfortable silence, they both realized the truth. The bond between them had not been forged in the fleeting, awkward moment of the bath, but in the crucible of the fire. It wasn't a romance born of longing or passion. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more resilient. It was a love of salvation. He had saved her from the fire, and she, with her stubborn, gentle faith, had saved him from the smoldering ruins of his own past. They were two broken people who, by reaching out to save each other, had found a way to become whole again. And in the middle of a town that was learning to rebuild, that was more than enough. A year passed. It was a year of sweat and sawdust, of shared meals and quiet understanding, of the rhythmic, hopeful sound of a hammer building a future. Dry Creek, born again from the ashes of its own fear, was a different town. The dust still blew, and the sun was still a merciless hammer, but the soul of the place had changed. Hope, once a foreign currency, was now the common coin. The day of the new schoolhouse's inauguration was the town's first true celebration. The building stood proud and solid, smelling of fresh-cut pine and new beginnings. It was not a grand structure, but it was theirs, built with their own hands, a testament to their own resilience. The entire town was there, dressed in their Sunday best. Women laid out pies and cold chicken on trestle tables, and the sound of children's laughter, loud and uninhibited, was a music the town had not heard in a very long time. Eleanor moved through the crowd, her heart so full it felt like a tangible presence in her chest. She was no longer Miss Hart, the outsider, the charity case. She was their teacher. She knew every child by name, every family by their triumphs and their troubles. She had found her parish not in the hallowed halls of a cathedral, but here, in the dirt and grit of a town that had decided to save itself. Caleb stood near the back, leaning against the new fence he had built, his arms crossed over his chest. The sling was long gone, but he still favored his left side when he was tired. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet watchfulness that was now more protective than haunted. He watched Eleanor as she organized the children for a song, a small smile touching his lips. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was a small, private thing, meant for her alone. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as the changing of the seasons. There were no grand declarations, no stolen kisses in the moonlight. There was something far deeper, a shared and silent partnership. He mended things for the school, a broken bench, a loose doorknob, and she would leave a fresh loaf of bread or a jar of preserves on his doorstep. They were two solitary people who had, without ever discussing it, simply ceased to be alone. The celebration was in full swing when Eleanor noticed the water barrel for the lemonade was running low. The older boys were supposed to be in charge of refilling it, but they were caught up in a game of tag, their whoops of joy echoing across the schoolyard. With a patient sigh and a shake of her head, Eleanor decided to manage it herself. Two of the miners had rolled a full, heavy barrel of fresh well water near the tables earlier. It just needed to be tilted onto the cradle. She put her shoulder to it, trying to lever the heavy cask up. It was heavier than she'd anticipated, the rough, damp wood digging into her hands. As she gave one final push, her grip slipped. The barrel rolled back, and the sharp edge of a metal hoop scraped hard against her forearm, tearing through her sleeve and the skin beneath. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, more from surprise than pain, and stumbled back, clutching her arm. The cut wasn't deep, but it was long and jagged, welling up with blood immediately. Sawdust and grime from the barrel were already embedded in the wound. Caleb was at her side in 3 strides, his celebratory stillness shattered. The crowd parted for him. He gently took her arm, his expression a mask of grim concern. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low and steady. He examined the cut with a practiced eye, his touch surprisingly gentle. "It's a nasty one. It needs to be cleaned properly, or it'll fester." Mrs. Abernathy bustled forward with a handkerchief. "Bring her into the store. I have some carbolic." "No," Caleb said, his decision absolute. "My place is closer, and I have what's needed." He looked down at Eleanor, his pale gray eyes leaving no room for argument. "Come with me." She nodded, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over her. With his hand securely on her elbow, he led her away from the concerned murmurs of the crowd.
away from the celebration, across the street to the forge and the small, attached rooms where he lived. It was the first time she had been inside his personal quarters since that terrible storm-tossed night. The forge itself was quiet and cool. The fire banked. He led her through a connecting door into his main room. The space was exactly as she would have imagined it: Spartan, orderly, and impeccably clean. A narrow bed was covered with a neatly folded woolen blanket. A small table held a single book and a clean plate. There was no clutter, no decoration, just the essential furniture of a solitary life. But it was not a sad room. It was a peaceful one, a quiet harbor. He sat her down in the room's only comfortable chair. "Stay here," he said, and disappeared into a smaller back room. He returned a moment later with a clean strip of linen and a small bottle of whiskey. "This will sting," he warned. As he knelt before her to clean the wound, she found herself looking not at her arm, but at his hands. They were the hands of a blacksmith, large and powerful, with calluses thick as leather and a tracery of old, white scars. But his movements were as precise and gentle as a surgeon's. He worked with a focused, quiet intensity, his touch both professional and profoundly personal. She flinched when he applied the whiskey, but his free hand came up to rest on her shoulder, a steadying, reassuring weight. "It needs a good washing first," he said, his brow furrowed in concentration as he finished cleaning the worst of it. "The dirt is deep in there." He stood up and looked around the room. There was the small wash basin he used for his face and hands, but it was not large enough. His gaze fell on the object that sat in the corner, the large wooden tub, scrubbed clean and turned on its side to dry. It was a permanent fixture in his small home. A silent, charged understanding passed between them. A faint blush rose on Eleanor's cheeks as he righted the tub and placed it on the floor between them. He said nothing, simply went to the stove, where a kettle of water was always kept warm. He poured the hot water into the tub, then tempered it with cool water from a bucket, the steam rising in the quiet, sunlit room. He knelt again and gently guided her injured arm toward the water. "Go on," he said softly. "It'll be easier this way." Eleanor looked down at the tub. It was the same tub, the same curved wooden staves, the same dark iron bands, but everything else was different. The room was not dark and terrifying, but filled with the warm, golden light of the afternoon sun. There was no confusion, no shame, only a quiet, shared purpose. There was no storm raging outside, only the distant, happy shouts of children. She dipped her hand into the water. It was warm and soothing. As she slowly washed the grime and blood from the cut, the water turning a faint pink, she felt as if she were washing away more than just the dirt. She was washing away the last, lingering shadow of that night. The memory, once so searing and shameful, was being replaced by this new one, an act of gentle, deliberate care. The water was no longer a symbol of a shocking, accidental intimacy, but of a quiet, healing one. It was a baptism, not of faith, but of acceptance. Caleb watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the faint color in her cheeks and knew she was remembering. He had to speak. He had to finally lay the ghost to rest, for both their sakes. He waited until she had finished and was gently patting her arm dry with a fresh cloth he had given her. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble in the stillness of the room. The scent stayed. "Eleanor." She froze, her hands stilling. She looked up at him, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. She did not know what he meant, but she knew it was important. He looked directly into her eyes, and for the first time she saw no walls there, no guarded past, only a clear, profound, and vulnerable truth. "Not from the bath," he clarified, his voice softening, "but from the day you walked into my life." The words were simple, but they landed in her soul with the force of a revelation. The scent.
He wasn't talking about the lavender and chamomile on her lost scarf. He was talking about her hope, her stubborn faith, the light she had carried into his dark, solitary world. That was the scent that had stayed with him, the fragrance of a life he had thought was lost forever. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face. They were not tears of sadness or shame, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like a physical release. The last of the tension, the last of the unspoken awkwardness that had existed between them, dissolved in that moment. She had been seen, truly and completely, by this quiet, broken man. He reached out and, with a thumb as rough as bark, gently wiped a tear from her cheek. Then he took the linen strip and began to bandage her arm, his movements slow and sure. The simple, practical act was imbued with all the things they could not say. It was a promise, a pledge, an acceptance. When he was done, he did not immediately let go of her hand. He held it for a moment, his large, warm palm cradling hers. The physical contact was a final, sealing act. It was an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, and everything that was to come. They walked back to the celebration together, stepping out of the quiet intimacy of his room and into the bright, noisy reality of the town they had helped to save. The children ran to her, asking about her arm, and she reassured them with a smile that was more radiant than they had ever seen. She and Caleb stood side by side, watching the children play in front of the new schoolhouse, a solid, tangible symbol of their shared future. They didn't need to speak, in the quiet washing of a wound, in a handful of simple, honest words. Everything that needed to be said had finally been spoken. The past had been cleansed, the fear washed away, and the door to the future had been gently, lovingly pushed open. Spring came to Dry Creek not as a quiet promise, but as a proven fact, an earned reward. The winter had been hard, with deep snows that had cut them off for weeks at a time, but it had been a season of consolidation, not survival. The meltwaters that now ran in the gullies were not a threat, but a lifeblood, soaking deep into the earth and coaxing a faint, stubborn green from the roots of the grama grass. The cottonwood trees along the creek bed fuzzed with new leaves, and for the first time in memory, the air tasted of something other than dust. It tasted of damp earth, of pine from the new schoolhouse, and of hope. The town itself had been reborn. The Silver Dollar Saloon was still there, but it was a quieter, less desperate place. Mr. Abernathy's store was thriving, its shelves stocked with goods paid for with honest wages from a mine now run by a fair-minded consortium from back east. The houses seemed to stand a little straighter, their porches swept clean, their windows washed. But the true measure of the change was in the sounds. The defining sound of Dry Creek was no longer the drunken shout or the crack of a gunshot, but the bright, chaotic music of children's laughter spilling from the open door of the new school. And through it all, like a steady, reassuring heartbeat, was the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel from the blacksmith's forge. The sound was the same, but its meaning had changed. It was no longer the lonely, angry sound of a man battling his demons. It was the sound of a town being built, of its essential parts being mended and made strong. Eleanor stood at the schoolhouse door, a small bell in her hand, watching her students chase a ball across the yard before the day's lessons began. The white scar on her forearm was a faint, silvery line now, a permanent reminder of the day everything had changed for the better. She was no longer the pale, uncertain girl who had stepped off the stagecoach into a world of ash. Her face had been browned by the sun, her hands were capable, and her eyes held a calm, steady confidence that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The town had shaped her, and in return, she was shaping its future, one letter and one number at a time. Caleb lived in the light now. He still rarely spoke more than was necessary, but the oppressive silence that had once surrounded him was gone.
replaced by a quiet, comfortable peace. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edge of town. He was its anchor. The townspeople treated him with a deep, abiding respect that went far beyond his skills with a metal. They had seen the man he was, not just in the fire, but in the slow, patient, back-breaking work of the rebuilding that followed. He had become their moral center, a quiet man of action whose integrity was as solid and reliable as the iron he worked. Their life together had found its own humble, unadorned rhythm. After she dismissed her students, Eleanor would walk the short distance to the small, sturdy house that Caleb had built for them next to the forge. It was a simple 2-room structure, but its windows were large, and it was filled with light. He would come in from his work, and she would have a basin of warm water waiting for him to wash away the day's grime. They would eat their supper at the small table he had made, sometimes talking about their day, a child's breakthrough in reading, a difficult weld on a wagon frame, but more often sitting in a shared silence that was more intimate than any conversation. Theirs was a companionship woven from mutual respect and a deep, unspoken understanding of the wounds they had helped each other to heal. Their love was not a soaring aria. It was a quiet, steady hymn, sung in the key of everyday kindness. One evening, as the last of the purple twilight faded from the sky, Eleanor sat at that table, a pen in her hand and a blank sheet of paper before her. A lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light on the smooth wood. It had been nearly 2 years since she had left St. Agnes, and she knew she owed the Mother Superior a letter, a proper accounting of her life. How could she even begin to explain the transformation? How could she describe the woman she had become to the sisters who had only known her as a pious, sheltered girl? She looked out the window. Caleb was in the forge, the orange glow of the fire illuminating his silhouette as he performed the slow, deliberate ritual of banking the embers for the night. The sight of him, so strong and steady, filled her with a quiet, powerful sense of peace. He was her home. This town was her home. She dipped her pen in the inkwell and began to write. She wrote of the school, of the children's names and their funny, endearing quirks. She wrote of the town's recovery, of the good people who had found their courage. She tried to describe the landscape, its harsh, stark beauty, the way the mesas turned to fire at sunset, the impossible, brilliant blanket of stars in the night sky. She wrote of the goodness she had found in people who had every reason to be hard and unforgiving. As she wrote, her mind drifted back over the path that had led her here. She thought of her arrival, the taste of dust and fear. She thought of Silas Crow, of the rumors, of the terrible shame that had felt like a physical illness. She remembered the lightning flash, the shocking, accidental intimacy of the bath, a moment that had felt like a mortal sin, and she remembered the fire, the terror, and the raw, selfless courage of the man now moving quietly about the forge outside her window. She sought to explain the nature of grace, which she had discovered was not a gift bestowed from a distant heaven, but a bucket of water passed from one thirsty soul to another in the desert. She had come to Dry Creek to bring God to a godless place, but she had found him already there, not in the empty church, but in the heart of a man who believed he had lost everything. She paused, the pen hovering over the paper, searching for the words that could contain the whole, impossible truth of her journey. She looked down at the faint, silvery line on her arm, and then at the clean, warm water in the basin on the washstand, waiting for Caleb. And then the words came, simple and clear. She wrote the last lines of her letter, a confession and a testament all in one. "You taught me that faith is a shield," she wrote, "but I have learned that it can also be a bridge. Once, I slipped by mistake into a stranger's bath. Now I live every day washed clean by kindness." She sealed the letter, her heart at peace. The story was told, the past was redeemed. Caleb came in then, his face tired but content. He nodded to the letter on the table, and she smiled. "Just telling them I'm not coming back," she said softly. He came and stood behind her chair, placing his large, warm hands on her shoulders. She leaned her head back against him, closing her eyes. The house was quiet, filled with the scent of baking bread and the faint, clean smell of coal smoke that always clung to him. Her scent had stayed forever, and so had he, but the fragrance was no longer that of lavender from a lost silk scarf, a memory of a moment of shame and confusion. It was now the indelible, enduring scent of a life built together, of human kindness, of a love that had not been sought, but forged. It was the scent of salvation, found not in a cathedral or a convent, but in the heart of a barren land that had, against all odds, learned how to bloom. Thank you for listening. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.